Welcome to the Case for a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. On each episode of this podcast, we examine a different Major League Baseball player's career, and I'll make the case for whether I believe this player does or does not deserve enshrinement in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. If you're someone who's shown YouTube videos of Shohei Ohtani playing with his dog Decoy during the 2023 American League MVP announcement, to your animal-loving friends and or significant others who aren't baseball fans but do like animals, in a blatant attempt to lure them into the world of baseball fandom by tugging at their heartstrings, then this is the podcast for you. As usual, friendly reminder, I've never played professional baseball, I'm just a fan. I'm also an attorney, and believe me when I say it's way more fun to debate the pros and cons of a player's hall-worthiness than it is to visualize yourself on a 1920s train platform in order to understand the pulse graph rule. The subject of our 9th episode is longtime Philadelphia Phillies second baseman Chase Utley. Now, Utley's an interesting case because he's someone who at his peak was a very good player, one of the best in the league, but maybe not the best, and a key part of a World Series winning team, the 2008 Phillies World Series team. But as I've mentioned on some of my previous episodes, this idea of a player's peak is a huge part of the Hall of Fame discussion. Just how long does a player's peak need to be in order to get in the Hall of Fame? Well, there's no set answer. It just depends on your opinion. That's why it's fun to discuss. And what constitutes a good peak? Do you need to be the best player in the league or just consistently very good? Again, there's no right answer. That's why it's fun to talk about this. There's a lot of nebulous concepts and theories, and that's why, a lot of these players that we discuss in this podcast and which you see a lot of discussion online about are, no offense, but, seen as borderline candidates. And that's why they're so fun to discuss. The open shut cases, nobody wants to debate the Hall of Fame worthiness of Hank Aaron or Willie Mays. They're obviously, the greatest of the greats. These borderline players are fun to talk about because while they might have certain categories that don't favor them, they have others that do. So it's a lot of fun, and it takes into account, what people think is important in terms of a Hall of Famer. So Utley's a really good candidate. It's going to be a fun episode because he's also one of those players in terms of my patented 3-part analysis of stats, hardware, and fame factor. He's someone who admittedly his stats fall a bit short, but then he's got some of these other factors in his favor. Just like Andrew Jones, we talked about in my last episode, Chase Utley's got a pretty extensive postseason career. And he's got some pretty incredible postseason accomplishments that really stand out and honestly form a huge part of his Cooperstown conversation. I think apart from Jones, he probably has the most postseason accomplishments and the strongest postseason accomplishment argument of any of the players we've discussed so far in this podcast. I take that into account, as you know, in the fame factor and in the hardware. I like to look at what the players did in the postseason. I think it matters to me. So if it matters to you, great. If not, that's fine too. So there's already a lot of great commentary out there on some of these borderline players like Chase Utley, and there's some great cases out there for and against their enshrinement, and a lot of it just depends on which stats you're looking at and what you find is important in your perspective as to what is a Hall of Famer, who should be in the Hall of Fame. So in that respect, I hope I can add some interesting perspective into the collective conversation regarding Chase Utley's Hall of Fame case. So without further ado, let's make the case for Chase Utley. Chase Utley spent 16 years in Major League Baseball, most notably with the Philadelphia Phillies between 2003 and 2015, before finishing the last 3 years of his career with the Los Angeles Dodgers. It was really interesting. This was a homecoming of sorts for Chase because he's originally actually from California. And like a lot of the players we've discussed in this podcast, he was a star player in high school. He went to Long Beach Poly High School, just right off the beach there in Long Beach, California. And it's actually the same high school where Tony Gwynn went. I always got to work a Tony Gwynn reference in whenever I can. As you know, big Tony Gwynn fan. According to an article from CBS News, his high school coach Bill Powell just heaped all kinds of praise on Utley as a high school player, calling him, quote, by far the greatest high school hitter I ever had or I've ever seen. He also said that Utley had, quote, the fastest hands I've ever seen in a high school player. In that same article, his coach Powell mentions a high school game where Utley was actually walked with the bases loaded, which is pretty incredible. His senior year, he batted .500 with a slugging percentage of over 1,000, and he struck out just twice in 80 at-bats. He also had a school single-season record of 14 home runs for the Jackrabbits. Man, what a great team name. High school mascot, the Jackrabbits. And just to put Utley's coach's comments into perspective, Utley was also teammates with Milton Bradley, who, as you recall, had a very good Major League career. He played 12 years in Major League Baseball. He was an All-Star in 2008. Finished with a .271 career batting average, 125 home runs. So, that's pretty high praise for Utley as a high school player. Utley's high school success ended up catching the eyes of local scouts for the LA Dodgers, who actually drafted him in the second round of the 1997 draft. But ultimately, Utley decided to go to UCLA on a baseball scholarship. Side note here, Jackie Robinson also played baseball at UCLA. So, when Utley started at UCLA as a freshman, he was actually a shortstop. But then in college, he was struggling in the field. He had some issues with his arm. There was some debate as to whether or not he had a strong enough arm. And he ended up moving to second base. The coach at the time, a guy named Gary Adams, kind of legendary baseball coach at UCLA, he decided to move Utley there to second base, and this move would have a huge impact on Utley's career because, of course, apart from a handful of games at third, first, and DH, Utley played almost his entire Major League career at second base. And it's good to mention this now because it's really difficult to analyze Chase Utley's Hall of Fame case without taking into account the fact that he is a second baseman. In that respect, I had the Joe Mauer episode, and I mentioned that you gotta, it depends on your perspective. Looking at Utley's Hall of Fame case, you kind of have to take that perspective of, well, he's a second baseman. We'll get into that. I don't want to get ahead, but another thing I mentioned in that Mauer episode, when you break down all of the MVP awards issued in Major League Baseball history, shortstops and second basemen are tied for the lowest position players to have received the MVP award with 16 apiece. Now, I say this, of course, position players. I'm not including pitchers and designated hitters. So, typically speaking, shortstops and second basemen don't get, MVP awards. And to put it succinctly, it's not an exaggeration to say it's not a knock. It's just calling it like it is. Generally, second baseman and shortstop are traditionally positions where a player's glove is valued first and foremost, and then the offense is kind of an afterthought. And, two players we've mentioned before in this podcast who got into the Hall of Fame mainly based on their defense are Ozzie Smith at shortstop and Bill Mazeroski at second base. Now, they did have some respectable offensive numbers, but offensively alone, they're not getting in. They got in on the strength of the glove, and that's sort of the blueprint for a lot of years for second basemen, shortstop, and interior infielders. Their glove is valued more than the bat, but if they can hit, great. So, interestingly, as a side note here, both of these players, Ozzie Smith and Bill Mazeroski, somewhat light hitters, yet are both famous for hitting huge key World Series home runs. So go figure. It's just a fun little side note on baseball history. Shows you the wonderful surprises of the postseason. So anyway, back to Chase. After Chase switched to second base in college, he worked really hard at his new position, and his hard work ethic paid off. And by his junior year, he ended up hitting .382 with 22 home runs at UCLA. He was selected to the All Pac-10 team and the Sporting News and National Collegiate Baseball Writers' first-team All-American team. So, had a lot of success there at UCLA. And he'd eventually be drafted by the Phillies in the first round of the 2000 Major League Draft and spent the better part of the next 3 seasons in the minors and did pretty well. He hit over .300 at the A level and then at the AAA level before making his Major League debut on April 4th, 2003 against the Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, I got to note this is a cool part of Chase's sort of origin story. Although he struck out in his first at-bat, about 2 weeks later on April 24, 2003, Utley recorded his first Major League hit, and man, what a hit. If you know, you know. His first Major League hit was actually a grand slam against the Colorado Rockies. There's a clip of this hit on YouTube. If you like watching baseball clips on YouTube, go check it out. It's awesome stuff. First of all, it's an old veteran stadium there in Philadelphia. The stadium looks about half empty, but you can't tell from the crowd noise. The crowd's going wild. I mean, grand slam, guy's first hit. So that's just a cool, that alone doesn't get him in the Hall of Fame, but it's just a cool little story about Chase Utley. That season, he only played 43 games for the Phillies in 2003. And then he only played 94 games in 2004. But he did show a lot of promise that 2004 season. He hit .266 with 13 home runs. Now, the only problem was that at the time, and if you're a Phillies fan, you probably remember this like it was yesterday, at the time, the Phillies already had a very good second baseman in Placido Polanco. So, long story short, won't get into it, but the Phillies, they picked Utley as their second baseman in the future, and they ended up trading Polanco to the Tigers. Now, this is just one of those interesting what-if trades. I love to play the what-if game if you listen to this podcast. What if the Phillies had kept Polanco? I don't know, because as it turns out, both guys had really, really good careers. Long story short, we won't get into that. The Phillies went with Utley. So after choosing Utley, after making him their full-time second baseman, in 2005, that's when he had his breakout season. He hit .291 with 28 home runs and 105 RBIs, and finished a very respectable 13th in the MVP voting that year. Now, that was just sort of the launching pad for the peak of Utley's career. We talked about the peak earlier. The 2004 through 2010 seasons, those 7 seasons, these are the absolute peak of Utley's career. And these are very respectable stats. Point this out. During that period, Utley averaged a .295 batting average a season, a .901 OPS, averaged 25 home runs, 90 RBIs, and 95 runs. So those are really good numbers for that's a good peak. Now, he's not putting up amazing, incredible numbers, but consistently very good numbers. In fact, I think this is a reflection of how good and consistent he was during that period. It's kind of up for debate which of those seasons was his best. Unlike Todd Helton, who we talked about in our second episode, Todd had that monster 2000 season. Utley never really had a monster season, but he was just consistently very good during that period. And I say I think that's a huge compliment. Sometimes players, we've talked about this before, they have that one monster season, they win the MVP, and then it's kind of crickets, the rest of their career. But he was consistently very good. And the fact that you can't really pick what his best season was during that period, I think is a testament to just how consistent, how good he was. But if I were going to pick, picking a name out of a hat here, I'd probably say 2007 was maybe his best season. He batted .332, just a few points behind Matt Holliday and Chipper Jones for the batting title. Almost got that batting title that year. And he also hit 22 home runs with 103 RBIs, and he had a 7.8 WAR, wins above replacement, which was third best in the National League that year behind Pujols and David Wright. Now, I want to stop right there. If WAR is your thing, all the warheads out there, I'm going to go kind of right into the statistics part here, the advanced statistics. Utley finished top 3 in WAR in the National League in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2009. And in fact, in 2008 and 2009, he was second in the National League in WAR behind Albert Pujols. So based on WAR alone, if WAR is your thing, Utley was one of the top 3 players in the National League for the 4-year period of 2006-2009. I mean, that's undisputed. If you believe in WAR, that's great. But, again, it's all about peak, and your perspective here is being one of the top players in the National League for a 4-year period going to get someone in the Hall of Fame? Not necessarily. And as we talked about with Andrew Jones last episode, that's really the highlight of Utley's career, because just like Andrew, it's kind of a tale of two careers. You see this in a lot of players, kind of a drastic drop-off. Between 2011 and 2018, Utley's batting average dropped. His average during that time period was .253 a season, and he was averaging only 10 home runs and 47 RBIs per season. So he did manage to hit .270 in 2014 and was actually named to his 6th and final All-Star team. But otherwise, the second half of his career was, it's fair to say, stark contrast to the first half. So that's why Chase's career in a nutshell, he had 6 straight very good seasons. I don't think he was the best in the league, but very good, one of the best, 4 of which by WAR alone, he was one of the top 3 players in the National League. But then he had 8 seasons of, let's just call it like it is, below average offensive production. Now, again, to be fair, around 2011, Utley did start having a lot of issues with injury, and I say this before, I'll say it again, father time comes for us all, and sports are a young man's game. But, he still managed to have a second act to his career, didn't have to retire early or anything like that. And it's kind of sad. As we'll talk now about sort of the, everyone has to stop playing at some point. In his last season, 2018, He only hit .213 in 87 games for the Dodgers, and sadly, he was eventually left off the Dodgers' postseason roster in a season where the Dodgers eventually made the World Series. They lost, of course, to the Red Sox, but it's kind of a sad ending because, as we'll get into it, we'll bring the conversation. We'll bring the holiday cheer back to the conversation because he did have a lot of highlights in the postseason, and that's kind of a big part of Chase Utley's Hall of Fame case. So I know I kind of already talked about it a little bit, but I want to get into the first part of the Hall of Fame case I like to make, and that is, of course, statistics. All right, let's look at Chase Utley's career stats. As you know, I kind of like to start out with the counting stats. And if counting stats are your thing, you're going to notice right off the bat, he falls short in a lot of categories. Let me just read them again. A 16-year baseball career, he's got 1,103 runs, 1,885 hits, 411 doubles, 58 triples, 259 home runs, 1,025 RBIs, 154 stolen bases. He's got 1,193 strikeouts. He's got a career batting average of .275, career on-base percentage .358, career slugging percentage of .465, and a career OPS of .823. I think he's kind of impressive. He's got over 3,000 total bases. He's got 3,189 total bases. So right off the bat, none of those counting stats really jump out at anyone. And look, I think in terms of a career, kind of a minimum threshold, you want to get over 1,000 runs, 1,000 RBIs, but 259 home runs is considerably less than a lot of players that are not in the Hall of Fame. Career .275 batting average, is not going to get you on the Hall of Fame just on the batting average. So a lot of those are falling short a little bit, which is why if you want to look at Chase's career, you really have to look at him kind of like we did with Joe Mauer. You got to look at Chase Utley as it relates to other second basemen. Now, among second basemen, even still, he's not really on the leaderboard. His .823 OPS is tied for ninth best all time with Joe Gordon and Bobby Doerr, and both of these guys are in the Hall of Fame. And in fact, this is probably a good argument in Utley's favor. The only eligible player with a career OPS as a second baseman higher than Utley, who's not in the Hall of Fame, is Jeff Kent. And Jeff actually ranks higher than Utley on a couple of these leaderboards. Most notable is the career home runs. Jeff Kent is the career leader for home runs for second baseman, which is sort of his elevator pitch in the Hall of Fame. We'll probably do an episode on Jeff Kent. I know we mentioned him before on the Todd Helton episode about winning that MVP, but I might have been a little disrespectful. I hope I wasn't disrespectful. I just thought that Todd Helton should have won the MVP instead of Jeff Kent. But Kent was still a good player. We'll probably get to an episode on him. So among second basemen, though, Chase Utley, he ranks 9th in OPS, as I mentioned. He ranks 9th in slugging, ranks 16th in RBI, 7th in home runs, Kent, of course, number 1, and 16th in doubles. So, these are amongst second basemen. These aren't all-time. If these were all-time, it'd be different. But, these are very respectable career counting stats, but nothing really stands out. And one thing, I will, try to be fair, and I also try to be a little critical. While he did have 4 seasons with 100 or more RBIs, it's really good. He also had 5 seasons with over 100 strikeouts. Not necessarily a knock against him, as I mentioned before. Reggie Jackson's the all-time leader in career strikeouts, but generally speaking, guys who strike out a lot are also home run hitters. If he's got 600 home runs, that's one thing, but 259 home runs is not going to get you in the Hall of Fame, and he struck out a lot, so to me that matters. Another thing I like to look at, as you know, I'm kind of a big fan of whether or not a player led the league in any categories. I realize it's a bit arbitrary, and there's nothing you can do if you're, like I said, Utley batted .332 in 2007. Well, other guys batted higher than him, so there's not a lot that he can do about that in terms of winning a batting title, but it just goes to show when you look at the statistics and the careers of some of these Hall of Fame players and you see year in, year out, they're consistently leading the league in a lot of categories. It's kind of a general, thing that you can use to measure, like, hey, this person is one of the better, if not, the best player in the league for this period. To me, it matters. So I will say, I've pointed out some of the players who talked about us, they never really led the league in any category. Utley led the league in one major offensive category, and that's runs in 2006 with 131 runs, which is really good, really good. The other thing I want to point out, I've mentioned in some of the other episodes that players, lead the league in games played or at-bats, and I don't really count that. This is a weird segue, but it's kind of fun to talk about. Chase Utley led the league in hits by pitch 3 times. He's actually 9th all-time for hits by pitch. I mean, it's just kind of a fun factoid more than anything. And just to be clear, it doesn't get him in Cooperstown. There are 5 players with higher hit by pitch totals who are not in the Hall of Fame, and a 6th, Anthony Rizzo, is still playing. And I know all of you are dying to know, so I'll just tell you. In case you were wondering, and I know you were, the all-time leader for hits by pitch is Hall of Famer Huey Jennings, who played between 1891 and 1918 and was hit by a pitch 287 times in his career, including 3 seasons with over 40 hit by pitches, including what is still a major league record 51 hits by pitch in 1896, and his 2 seasons in 1897 and 1898 of 46 hits by pitch are still good enough for 3rd single highest hit by pitch totals of all time. Now, I know if you listen to this podcast, I tend to go on some segues, but I got to do one here. So I had to dig a little deeper to find out why in the heck Huey Jennings keeps getting hit by pitch so much. And old reliable Wikipedia wasn't terribly helpful other than to say, and I gotta say this, that, quote, Jennings was, quote, known for his colorful antics, hoots, whistles, and his famous shouts of ee-yaw and other whoops, whistles, horns, gyrations, jigs, and grass plucking. So if you're a follower of the unwritten rules of baseball, there's your answer right there. Pretty sure any one of those will probably get the ball thrown at you. So it also says that his ee-yaw whoop became his trademark and was accompanied with waves of both arms over his head and a sharp raising of his right knee. That'll probably get you thrown at as well. But wait, there's more. It also says he liked to taunt his opponents with a tin whistle, which, if we're being brutally honest, that alone is just enough to get a dude drilled by the baseball on a regular basis. I got it. That's funny. Tin whistle. Then according to his Sabre biography, but there's more. There's more on old Huey Jennings. Jennings actually attended Cornell Law School in the offseason. I'm an attorney. I found that fascinating. And although he didn't graduate, he took and passed the bar exam and was a, quote, highly regarded trial lawyer in his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania, which, if we're being honest again, being a lawyer, that alone is probably enough to get you drilled by a pitcher, depending on your opinions of lawyers. So it's okay. I've heard every lawyer joke you can make. I got thick skin. It's all right. Jennings' Sabre biography also says that Jennings, and I'm not making this up, he would play with rubber snakes and jack-in-the-boxes when Rube Waddell pitched, and even once brought dogs into the dugout to distract Rube while he's pitching. Now, if you know who Rube Waddell is, if you're a baseball history nerd, you know anything about him, he was a pitcher. He's very easily distracted and apparently would chase fire trucks when he pitched. He's a strange guy. So, bit of a sidetrack segue here, but this is as good a time as any. Say, Hollywood, if you're listening, we need movies about the early days of baseball, about Huey Jennings and old Rube Waddell chasing fire trucks. Anyway, bit of a long segue, but I had to find out who led the league in hit by pitches. I'm sure you were fascinated and curious as well. So anyway, I digress. Let's get back to Chase Utley. As I mentioned, he's not atop any leaderboards, not even really for second baseman. He falls short on most counting stats, but he does have a career 64.5 WAR. I talked earlier, kind of skipped ahead to the stats. I talked about how he had, really 4 seasons where he was top 3 in WAR. He has a very good and respectable career WAR of 64.5, which actually tied with Willie McCovey, who's in the Hall of Fame, of course, and Mookie Betts, current player, who probably will be in the Hall of Fame, for 98th all time. So that puts Utley in pretty good company there with Willie McCovey and Mookie Betts. So, this is good. In fact, there's a lot of Hall of Famers with lower career WARs, including Dave Winfield, Richie Ashburn, and Vlad Guerrero. So, there's hope. But to be fair, there are also a lot of non-Hall of Famers with higher career WARs than Chase Utley, including guys like, Dwight Evans is a borderline candidate. A lot of people think he should get in. But, 3 guys who popped out were Reggie Smith, Buddy Bell, and Bobby Grich. Maybe there's some super fans out there. I don't know, but I've never really heard anyone mentioning any of those guys as being Hall of Famers. So, the 64.5 WAR is good, very good, very respectable. And again, not a knock on Utley at all in any of this episode, but it doesn't really get him in that sweet spot like we talked about in the Lou Whitaker episode 70 or 75, where everyone above that number is either in or not in because of PEDs or should be in. So 64.5, just under that sort of sweet spot. So counting stats alone, got to say, great career, but a really short peak, small peak. Doesn't sit atop any leaderboards. Didn't really check any boxes on counting stats other than apparently being 9th all-time for hits by pitch, which is more of, again, just sort of a fun factoid, and it's not going to get anyone in Cooperstown. And then defensively, look, I know I make jokes, and some of you guys out there listening, I love to get into fielding statistics, but if that's your favorite part of the episode, I got sad news for you. We're not going to spend a lot of time on fielding statistics because defensively, he doesn't rank on any leaderboards for counting stats, traditional stats, or advanced fielding stats. So we don't get to talk about range factor, fielding percentage, and like that. Chase Utley is just kind of nowhere near the leaderboard for anything. And as a result, he never won any Golden Gloves, which brings us to our next category, of course, hardware. Now, Chase Utley's Hall of Fame case is really interesting for a lot of reasons, one of which is the fact that he's a second baseman, and when we're looking at hardware, he never won a Gold Glove award. I mentioned before, lots of times historically, second baseman and shortstops were sort of viewed as defense first and offense second. That's kind of interesting. Not only does he not have really any statistical argument in terms of his fielding, he also doesn't have any Gold Gloves. But that doesn't mean he's a bad player. In fact, as we mentioned before, during his peak, he was a very good offensive player. And he was a 6-time All-Star and a 4-time Silver Slugger. It's really interesting, too. He also received MVP votes in 5 consecutive seasons, 2005 to 2009, including 3 top 10 finishes. And as I mentioned before, finishing in the top 3 in WAR a number of seasons. So, again, never had that one standout monster year, but was just consistently very good and very good at the plate. I'm not saying he was a bad defensive second baseman. It's just he wasn't, really winning any awards. He wasn't really setting any records. So just right there in terms of hardware, 6-time, he certainly, just caveat for Chase and any player I discuss on this podcast. If I'm dedicating an episode to the player, it means they had a very good career and they have a very good argument, in favor of the Hall of Fame, and it's worth debating. So, there's nothing personal here. It's a fun debate, who belongs in the Hall of Fame. A lot of people think, it should be a smaller and should be just the greats of the greats. And so we're just trying to figure out, who belongs in there amongst the greats. And there's no disrespect. There's a lot of great players who are not in the Hall of Fame. And a lot of Hall of Famers weren't in for a long time and got in eventually. So, there's hope. So just the fact we're talking about him is good. But look, if I'm being fair, 6-time All-Star, there's a lot of people with 6 or more All-Star selections that aren't in the Hall of Fame and probably won't be. Same with the Silver Slugger. People have won more than 4, not in the Hall of Fame, probably won't be. And there's a lot of people with a lot of Golden Gloves who aren't in the Hall of Fame and probably won't be. There's people who've won MVP awards, Rookie of the Year awards, Cy Young awards, not in the Hall of Fame, probably won't be. There's people who've won multiple MVP, Cy Young awards, and aren't in the Hall of Fame. Dale Murphy, first episode we talked about, back-to-back MVP awards. Roger Maris, back-to-back MVP awards. Juan Gonzalez has 2 MVP awards. Now, Juan and a couple of other guys, there might be some clouds of suspicion, but in terms of Cy Young, I think I've mentioned Brett Saberhagen. Guy had 2 Cy Young awards, or Tim Lincecum, had a short peak. Johan Santana. The list goes on of players who you could say, hey, that person was the best, hitter or pitcher, for a period of time, not in the Hall of Fame. So, when you're already a borderline candidate, it's great, again, great career. You got MVP votes in 5 consecutive seasons, 3 top 10 finishes, but never won an MVP award, never won Golden Glove award. So right there on his hardware, nothing jumps out as wow. I realize MVP votes can be somewhat arbitrary, just like kind of, Hall of Fame votes is not a perfect science, but, it matters. It means something. So never stood out as the best player in the league. So that gets to the next thing I mentioned earlier, the postseason. I like to take into account, as you know, a player's postseason performance when it comes to the hardware factor. And for Chase, this is probably, if not one of the best argument he's got, in addition to being a very good player for, I think a bit of a short, but a peak, had a period of years. He was also very good in the postseason. Now, he had a low batting average in that 2008 World Series, but I gotta mention he had 2 home runs in that 2008 World Series that the Phillies won, and he had a key defensive play that a lot of people think sort of turned the tide of the series for them. So he was a key part of that 2008 World Series champ. Philadelphia Phillies team. He also batted .353 in the NLCS that season, so it's fair to say, look, he was a big part of the Phillies' postseason success in 2008, the year they won the World Series. He had a couple other good series as well. In the 2009 NLDS, he batted .429. In the 2011 NLDS, he batted .438. And then he actually, I mentioned he kind of had a decline, but hey, in 2015 for the Dodgers, he hit .333 in the NLDS in 2015. So guy came to play when it mattered. To me, look, that means something. Winning matters. I think it's important. I did knock on Billy Wagner a little bit in my episode because he didn't do well in the postseason. I think it matters. Hall of Famers do Hall of Fame things. And, if you're looking at Chase Utley through that lens, hey, when he got into the postseason, he came to play and he did very well. He won the 2008 World Series with the Phillies. And then, if people forget this, the Phillies also won the pennant again in 2009, but eventually fell to the Yankees 4-2 in the World Series. Now, while the Phillies didn't win that World Series again in 2009, it's not because of Utley. Utley had a great series. And in fact, if you were going to make an elevator pitch for Utley, of course, the regular season really is where, the bulk of the players' Hall of Fame consideration comes from. But the postseason, the World Series accolades, they're the sizzle on the steak. It helps. It pushes a borderline candidate's case forward. And in Utley's case, look, we got to talk about his 2009 World Series performance. You got to talk about it because it may be one of the best arguments in his favor. They won in 2008, and then in 2009, Utley just was on another level. He had 5 home runs and 8 RBIs in the 2009 World Series. In Game 1 of that 2009 World Series, he set a postseason record for consecutive games reaching base with 26. And, to quote Al Pacino, Utley was just getting warmed up. That's my terrible Al Pacino Scent of Woman impersonation. In my last episode on Andruw Jones, I mentioned Andrew's 2-home run game in Game 1 of the 1996 World Series at Yankee Stadium. And so there's a lot of similarities there with Andruw Jones and Utley because, look, and I say this as a Braves fan, but, as a baseball fan, there's just something mythical about Yankee Stadium, especially the old Yankee Stadium. So anytime a player does something cool or special at Yankee Stadium, just gives us baseball nerds goosebumps. So in that 2009 World Series Game 1, granted it was in the new Yankee Stadium, but still, Utley would hit, just like Andrew did in 96, 2 home runs in Game 1 of that 2006 World Series. Not only that, but those 2 home runs came off CC Sabathia, who's still got a few years left till he's eligible, but I think it's fair to say CC Sabathia is probably going to get into the Hall of Fame. So great pitcher. Utley hit these 2 homers off a legit star pitcher who was at the peak of his career. CC had just won the 2007 Cy Young Award. And in 2009, 2010, he led the American League in wins, finished top 5 Cy Young voting. So, it just goes to show Utley had an incredible postseason, historic moment in Game 1 of the 2009 World Series, hitting 2 home runs off, one of the best, if not the best pitcher, arguably in the league at that time. So just a great achievement. But wait, there's more. As of the 2009 World Series, Utley was one of only 2 left-handed hitters to hit 2 home runs in a World Series game against a left-handed pitcher. I'll say that again. It's kind of a mouthful. He was one of only 2 left-handed hitters to hit 2 home runs in a World Series game against a left-handed pitcher. The other batter, some guy named Babe Ruth. So the fact he did this in Yankee Stadium, Chase Utley, that's pretty cool. Utley hit another home run in Game 4, and then he hit 2 more home runs in Game 5 to give him the aforementioned 5 home runs in that World Series, which at the time tied Reggie Jackson for the most home runs in a World Series. The record, of course, since been tied by George Springer in 2017 World Series. So I dug in a little bit here on Utley's postseason accolades because honestly, that's a big part of Utley's career in his Hall of Fame case. He's tying records with Babe Ruth and Reggie Jackson. I mean, he's fair to say, I picked on Billy Wagner a little bit, and I think I dinged his case down a little bit because it was postseason. So I'd have to crank Utley's case up a little bit because of the postseason. The guy, especially this 2009, I mean, what a World Series. If they'd won the World Series, the Phillies that year, it's fair to say, I'm sure he would have been the World Series MVP, and maybe that would have changed some voters' minds. I don't know, but look, all that aside, I gotta say though, to be fair, look at both sides of the story here. There's a lot of teams that win the World Series. Those teams have a lot of good players. There's a lot of players that have great postseasons, great World Series, but do they all get in the Hall of Fame? Is this enough? So far, I think, while this is great and Utley is a great player, I think his regular season stats, his counting stats, even his WAR just aren't quite Hall of Fame worthy. And that brings us to the last category. Is there any, glimmer of hope left for Chase in his fame factor? We're going to go into the mystic here and see if there's anything nostalgic, mystical that might push old Chase over the edge here. So if I'm being candid, and feel free to disagree with me. It's a fun debate. I like to have it. I never really thought of him as a Hall of Famer. During his peak, I thought, okay, he might be on his way to a Hall of Fame career, but I think it was a short peak. I'm just being fair. I think there's other players that also had good, 6-7 year peaks. I don't know if that gets him in. In my opinion, I don't think that would get him in. And arguably, here's another thing too. During that period when he was on the Phillies and the Phillies were, having that successful run there, arguably Chase Utley wasn't even the best player on his team during that peak. 2005 to 2010, we always remember the end of his career. Players kind of fall off, but you got to remember Ryan Howard during that period was just a feared hitter. And that's not just my opinion. During that 2005-2010 period, Ryan Howard averaged 279 batting average a season, averaged 42 home runs, 124 RBIs, and 305 total bases a season. So he was having monster years. And, again, it's not just my opinion. You got to remember during that period, Ryan Howard was a 2005 National League Rookie of the Year, 2006 National League MVP, and finished in the top 5 in MVP voting in 2007, 2008, 2009. So, I mentioned before, you could say Utley may have been one of the best 3 players in the league. It's also arguable that he wasn't even the best player on his team. In fact, there's actually another player currently on the ballot who could also arguably lay claim to the title of best player on those late-aughts Philly teams, and that, of course, is Jimmy Rollins. Played for the Phillies between 2000 and 2014. And between 2004 and 2009, doesn't quite overlap with Utley, but basically the same. Rollins won 3 Gold Gloves, he won a Silver Slugger, and he was the 2007 National League MVP. He also averaged 113 runs and 185 hits during that period. So it's arguable that, Utley may not even have been the second best player on his team during that period. It's a fun debate to have. It reminds me, if you're a music fan, if my buddies, you know who you are, I won't mention your names, but if my buddies are listening, some of my Braves fan buddies are Drive-By Truckers fans, if you know the band Drive-By Truckers. I always make jokes that it's Patterson Hood's band, and I said he's like the 3rd best songwriter in the band because the band also had Jason Isbell and Cooley. So I'm like, Anyway, Patterson Hood's a great songwriter, great musician. I'm not trying to knock Patterson Hood, and not to get off on a little segue, but it's kind of funny. It's like, Chase Utley, if the Phillies are the Drive-By Truckers, Utley is arguably Patterson Hood. Maybe he's the 3rd best player on this team. So does that make him a Hall of Famer? He's not necessarily, the best player arguably on his team. To me, he doesn't quite have that sizzle. It doesn't have that fame factor. Now, I hate to do this, but if you listen to my show, I always try to be fair and objective, and I can't do a show about Chase Utley without mentioning something that kind of impacts his fame factor. So just kind of say it and we'll move on. If you recall, in the 2015 National League Division Series against the New York Mets, Chase Utley was sliding to second base really hard. Ended up, he's trying to break up a double play, which I'll stop right there and say, look, I've watched baseball for a long time. If you go watch online clips in the 70s, 80s, and especially before, players did this all the time. It was common practice. They're just playing hard. They're trying to win. But anyway, Chase Utley in 2015 National League Division Series against the Mets, he slid so hard into second base trying to break up the double play that he hit Mets shortstop Ruben Tejada and ended up breaking Tejada's leg. It's really sad. And look, in all fairness, Utley you could tell right then, Utley felt bad about it. Obviously, he didn't want that to happen. But nevertheless, he slid into the guy, trying to break up the double play, a bit of an aggressive slide, ended up breaking the guy's leg. And Tejada, really sad, his career was never really the same. And they actually, it's kind of a long story, I won't get off on it. They ended up changing the rules basically because of this play that Utley did to try to make players, a little more safe, try to get rid of these, intentional, hits essentially at second base. So I don't want to get off on it, but, if we're talking about the fame factor, one of the things that stands out is Utley being a good player on this, Phillies team that had a good run, but maybe not the best player. Although he did have an outstanding performance in that 2009 World Series. But, one of the things people remember Chase Utley for is, hitting Ruben Tejada and breaking his leg. So if I were voting, this wouldn't detract from my vote. And there's a lot of people that say, look, this just shows he's a hard player. If you remember, Pete Rose in an All-Star game collided with catcher Ray Fosse, injured the guy pretty bad, and the guy was never the same, and he was a good catcher too. So, may have had a Hall of Fame career, who knows? So, and a lot of people look at that and say, well, that's just Pete Rose. Guy played hard, and a lot of people kind of defended Pete Rose for that. And you might look at this situation and say the same thing. Chase Utley plays hard. He's trying to break up double play. It's nothing that other players weren't doing, but it's just really unfortunate. So I hate to bring it up, but I have to. I have to talk about it. We're talking about the fame factor. That wouldn't detract from my vote if I were a voting member of the Baseball Writers Association of America, but it certainly doesn't help his fame factor. But he was just generally thought of as a good player, very good player. And if I had to vote, we'll wrap this up here. I hate to say it, but I don't think Chase Utley would get my vote as a Hall of Famer. He's a very good player, but overall his career counting stats, even his WAR, just don't stack up, I think, with other Hall of Famers. He's got less than 2,000 hits, which even though, we talked about the Andrew Jones, but Andrew Jones had almost twice as many home runs, had a lot more home runs. Well, probably not twice as many, math's not my strong suit, but over 400 home runs. Utley just didn't really have the counting stats. He led the league in runs once, and then the hit by pitch is just really like a Jeopardy question or anything more than anything. It didn't really help his Hall of Fame case. So, he's a good player. He had a good career. He's certainly, nothing to be ashamed of. Played hard, played well. Has a lot to show for it. But if I'm voting, again, getting back to the perspective conversation we have with Joe Mauer, I'm kind of a small hall guy. I like the best of the best. That being said, I like to look at players who I think, are the best of the best, but just got overlooked. And I don't think Utley is one of those players. Good player. And if just in case you're wondering, it's not because I'm a Braves fan. He's a Phillies fan. I give respect, where respect is due, and I'll give props. I'm talking about Yankee Stadium here and how mythical it is. I'll say that. And look, there's a lot of Phillies players I like. There's a lot of Mets players I like. It's fine. It's not just I'm a Braves fan. I just don't think Chase Utley is a Hall of Famer. So if you agree with me or you disagree with me, feel free to let me know on Twitter at @TheCase4. Thank you so much for listening. Please stay tuned for my next episode where we discuss the Hall of Fame case for Carlos Beltran. In the meantime, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.